Good evening. Welcome to the second webinar of year 2021 organized by Library and Publication Development Committee of IESL. Today we have another key topic to discuss, that is importance of disaster resilience and sustainability in development. It is all about development, human being, ecosystem and climatic conditions, relationship with storm, flooding issues, land use, urbanization, and many other factors. With regard to sustainable development and disaster resilience, are we going in right direction? What are the possible improvement opportunities? For that, we have in order to discuss this, we have very professional and eminent panel members. Let me introduce them. Mr. Susit Arandapola, Team Leader, Nature-Based Landslide Risk Management Project Sri Lanka. Further, he functioned as Executive Director of ACDP, Asian Development Preparedness Center in Thailand. Dr. Asiri Karnawardana, Director General, NBRO. His major interest in R&D is resilient construction and landslide risk reduction. Professor Janaka Vijayatunga, Senior Professor, Civil Engineering Department, Faculty of Civil Engineering, University of Peradeniya. Professor Ranjit Disanayake, Secretary, State Ministry of Rural Roads and Other Infrastructure, Chairman of Green Building Council, and Senior Professor of Civil Engineering Department of University of Peradeniya. Ladies and gentlemen, we have few rounds of discussions today. So in order to commence, let's begin with the first round. That is, we are going to talk about all definitions of disaster management, sustainability, and many other related topics. So each panel member is requested to talk their ideas or share their ideas 3 minutes time allocation given time. So let me ask the first question from Professor Janaka Vijayatunga. Sir, good evening and thank you very much for participating to this event. And if I ask from you, how do you define the word resilience in all segments, such as resilience economy, resilience society, or resilience industry, or we can say, of course, resilience people also. So how do you define this word to the audience today?
Right. And thank you, Engineer Jayatunga. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay. Good evening to you all. And so let me first thank the organizers of this panel discussion for inviting me and also choosing this important topic. So our focus here will be more on disaster resilience this evening. But to begin the discussion, I have been asked to define the word resilience in more general terms. Now, broadly speaking, as you know, resilience is the ability to withstand adversity or difficult situations, and quite importantly, then being able to bounce back. So resilience is pretty much being able to withstand or absorb external stresses or external shocks, and then spring back, bounce back. So let's say it's being able to take a punch and get back to how you were or where you were, or indeed, if possible, to an even better level. And talking about these stresses and shocks, now in the context of disaster management, stresses and shocks are usually the hazards to which the elements at risk are exposed and potentially lead into a disaster situation. Now, some are rapid onset hazards and some others are slow onset. Now, earthquake or tsunami, for example, belong to the rapid onset or rapid occurrence category. And on the other hand, for example, drought, as you know, is a slow onset hazard. Similarly, sea level rise is also a slow onset potential hazard. And as a result, in the case of slow onset hazards, people and communities have more time to even adapt to the new situation. Now, by the way, the biological hazard that we all have been going through since around March, isn't it, last year? The COVID-19 pandemic is also obviously a slow onset hazard. Now, as Engineer Jayatunga also mentioned, not only an individual or a community, but obviously an entire society or its systems can get affected. So we talk about economic resilience, which is the capacity of an economy to resist a particular shock and then to rapidly recover to the previous level of growth or even to a better level. And as we all know, at the moment, the economies the world over have been affected by the ongoing COVID pandemic. Some economies have been affected more than the others by the stresses and disruptions caused by this ongoing pandemic. Now, more resilient economies are able to bounce back better. They will be able to bounce back better than those that are not so resilient. And the same applies to a society or an industry. So we have resilient societies and resilient industries that can absorb significant stresses, or let's say take a blow and then recover. Now, finally, let me also just mention that the resilience of a community against a potential multi-hazard environment is determined by the degree to which the community has the necessary resources and also how capable that community is in organizing itself, both prior to and during the times of need. So clearly resources as well as preparedness are important here. And I guess quite soon we'll be focusing more on disaster resilience. Yes. And so with that, let me hand you back to our moderator, Engineer Tilak Jayatunga.
Thank you, Professor. I think all what we got from your definition is actually withstanding to external stresses or shocks.
Right.
Is the key thing that it is relevant to all segments. Yes, as you mentioned, it is relevant to current context of Sri Lanka also. So we have to check whether we are resilience enough in our society for many segments. Yes, very good definition. So let me turn to Dr. Asiri Karunawardhan. Actually, he is the head of a very important institute in Sri Lanka, Director General. So, and BRO. So, Dr. Asiri, what is resilience in disaster management? I know that you have been working with this segment for so many years. So, you must be feeling about this resilience. You should have a good taste on this resilience. So, what is resilience in disaster management?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this important session. And I think Professor Wijetunga took a very good initiations for defining the word resilient in very clear manner. So when it comes to the resilient disaster management, as you know, I mean, there are many kind of disasters, natural disaster or man-made disaster. So what do you mean by the resilient disaster management? So once the disasters happen, for example, heavy earthquake, landslide or flood, as Professor Wijetunga mentioned that, so it affects the community, it affects the society, it affects the transportation, it affects all the sectors. So once it affects, so you know, countries' economy is going down, all the infrastructure is blocked. So I mean, if we have a resilient disaster management within a very short period, we should continue our business. So business can be continued without much interruption. So if we have this kind of infrastructure system, so we can say we have a very good resilience in the disaster management. For example, countries like Japan. So once they have the kind of heavy earthquake, but I think the following day they can continue all these activities. So that means they have a very good resilience in terms of disaster management. So I think as Professor Vijay mentioned that in terms of the if we define as per the UN ISDR, so the ability of countries, communities, and household to manage change by maintaining of transforming living standard in the face of shocks or stresses such as earthquake, drought, or violence without compromising their long-term prospects. So in simply say, so if we have a development plan, so suddenly if there is a disaster like man-made or whatever, so it should not affect our long-term goals. So if we have this kind of system, we can say we have very good resilience in the disaster management. I think when it comes to Sri Lanka, so the major disaster, so yeah, I think we have to have this kind of system. Still, I think we are somewhat behind that, but I think we have to aim for this kind of resilient and disaster management in the future. Thank you.
So you mean to say that so in Sri Lanka, we are still developing a disaster management resilience plan, or rather we are yet to go, right? That is what you're telling. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Asiri. And
can I make a small comment? I think I should mention that one.
Yeah.
So as you know, in 2004, we have the Indian Ocean tsunami. So with that, of course, our people, our policymakers realized that it is important to have this resilience in the disaster management and resilience in the all the aspects. So I think that is a turning point. So from 2004 to now, we have come a long way, but still some way to go. I think with the tsunami experience, I think we have the Disaster Management Ministry, Disaster Management Center, then the relevant technical agencies are working on that. So when it comes to the world standard, so Hugo framework, the Sendai framework, there are a lot of things. So we have to inline with these aspects to come to the world standards. Thank you.
Okay, so you are working on that, I believe. Yes, essentially you should be a member of that working committee. Okay, Professor Ranjit Dissanayake, being the founder of this Green Building Council, may I ask from you that how do you define the sustainability and what is the interconnection between sustainability and disaster resilience? Two different words, two different, I think, although two different words, it's oriented in one direction. So how do you define sustainability and disaster resilience?
There are several definitions for the sustainability, but most common definition is to whatever the activity that we are doing right now, we should not compromise and do the using the future generation needs. So we have to make sure that the future generations need will be look after whatever the activities that we do. If you, for example, natural resources, if you try to grab the natural resources unnecessarily, future generation maybe will be in trouble. Therefore, we have to make sure that whatever the activity that we do, there won't be effect for the future generation. That is the one kind of definition for the sustainability. Your next question was the connection between the resilience and the sustainability. Of course, even in the 2030 agendas, Sustainable Development Goals, the resilience is the center, because if our infrastructure is not going to survive for the extreme natural disaster, people cannot survive. Therefore, the sustainability mean the resilience is embedded. It's a center. Therefore, whatever sustainable development that we are planning right now today, we have to make sure that that is resilient. It can be infrastructure, it can be any other program that we do. It must be resilient. Otherwise, you can't say that it is sustainable development. Therefore, it is very much interconnected. Hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I think what you are trying to say is actually resilience is embedded to this broad sustainable definition and sustainable goals. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Uh, Mr. Arambepola, how do you link these nature-based solutions? I think you have been working with this segment for so long, nationally and internationally. So, nature-based solutions, I want to get focus answer from you on nature-based solutions, connection with sustainable development. How do you link those two together?
Thank you, Engineer Jayatunga. I would like to, discuss little bit the background first. Let me ask why development is necessary for us. The answer is it is to meet the needs of ever increasing population. We need to provide housing, establish new settlements, develop infrastructure, produce enough food to feed, and find energy solutions. So development is necessary, but it becomes a problem when it is not happening in a planned way. Then building resilience will be a challenge. We know that there are many features within the landscape that helps in mitigating the impact of different types of hazards by their presence and functions. What are they? I can give you a few examples such as rivers, water bodies, forests, wetland, mangroves, sand dunes, etc. They are also responsible for different ecosystem services and goods such as water supply and air purification, natural recycling of waste, soil formation, pollination, and maintaining all other living organisms. Most importantly, they are also influencing the control of climate conditions and also reducing the hazard impact. For instance, forest ecosystem help in carbon storage, nutrient cycling, water and air purification. But more forest is being cleared for different development interventions. In 1920s, the island had around 49% forest cover, but by 2005, this has fallen by approximately 28%. In 2018, forest cover is around 29%. In the same way, if you see the wetlands help in flood retention, but they are also being reclaimed to provide room for housing, settlements, build factories for infrastructure development. So studies indicate that 63% of the wetland in Colombo metropolitan region have disappeared during the last 6 years. So changes in land use pattern with increasing population pressure diminish both the quality and quantity of land and water resources, contributing increase in the risk. So if we are to build climate or disaster resilience to withstand future shocks, we also need to contain the risk factor. We cannot build resilience for unknown types of shocks, which will be the result otherwise. So nature-based solutions are an umbrella concept for protection, restoration, or enhance the effect of ecosystem services by introduction of green infrastructure to provide vital links between sustainable socio-economic development, biodiversity, and ecosystem conservation in order to achieve resilience to various shocks such as climate associated and also other disaster-related risks. So I will stop here and I will explain further in the next round.
Thank you, Mr. Arambepola. I think we got a good definition on good idea on the link between nature-based solution and sustainable development. With that, we are going for the second round. Actually, in the second round, we are going to see how this international scenario focusing on international other countries focusing on this situation and some examples on sustainability and resilience. So each panel member is requested to take 3 minutes for this round also. Let me ask from Professor Janaka Wijetunga first. What are the international protocols for sustainability? And
Yes, there have been, in fact, a number of international protocols or agreements for disaster risk reduction, resilience, and sustainability, particularly since this 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami disaster. So in fact, this, as you know, December 2004 tsunami, that massive tsunami was sort of a wake-up call, not only for this region, but also for the entire world. So there have been many disaster awareness and disaster risk reduction initiatives that have been taken since December tsunami, December 2004 tsunami. And now, if we consider the past 2 decades, there was this Hyogo framework for action that was adopted at the UN World Conference on Disaster Reduction, and that was held in 2005 in Japan. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of the 2004 tsunami. So this Hyogo framework was on building the resilience of communities and nations to disasters. And that framework was in force from 2005 through to 2015. So that is over a 10-year period. And so this Hyogo framework expired in 2015, 5 years ago. And then at the UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction held in 2015, again in Japan, they adopted this well-known Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And this time, for the period from 2015 to 2030, a 15-year time period. So we are now 5 years into that action plan. So that is about 1/3 of the way. Now, among other things, if I highlight just one identified priority area in this Sendai framework, that is priority number 3, which is on investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. And that calls for public and private investment in disaster risk reduction through both structural and non-structural measures. And obviously, the eventual idea here is to enhance the resilience of individuals, communities, and their properties, assets, and of course, as well as the environment. So we also want to ensure that this effective recovery, rehabilitation, and then any reconstruction if required, this with this build back better concept. And so we just noted the Hyogo framework first, which expired in 2015, and then for the time period 2015 to 2030, we now have the Sendai framework, Sendai agreement. And if I very quickly move on to another important protocol, that is this 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which Professor Dissanayake just a short while back just touched on. And that was adopted by all UN member countries in 2015. And in fact, as you all know, there are 17 sustainable development goals, SDGs, which all countries, both developed and developing, are supposed to work towards in a sort of a global partnership. Now, obviously, these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, cover or span over many areas, but disaster management, disaster risk reduction, by its very nature, it cuts across different areas and aspects of development. So in fact, there are 25 targets related to disaster risk reduction in 10 of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So clearly, disaster risk reduction and importantly, working towards resilience, those are core development strategies in that action plan. Now, as to the, you also asked me, Engineer Jayatung, that the current situation of achievements. So as for that, globally, I suppose some countries may have done better than others, but right now, I don't have any statistics or any details of quantification of such achievements. But as for Sri Lanka, when it comes to disaster risk reduction, and as quite rightly Dr. Asiri also mentioned earlier, When it comes to disaster risk reduction in this country, we have made significant progress since this 2004 tsunami. So compared to what it was prior to 2004, we have in fact come a long way in the past 15 years or so in many aspects of disaster risk management. So there have been many achievements, which I will not go into detail given the limited time, but of course, still a long way to go towards achieving resilience in sort of more broader terms. So with that, back to you, Engineer Jayatunga.
Yeah. I think we got a fair amount of understanding on that actually. Now, I'm once again, I'm the same question in a different way. I'm asking from Professor Ranjit Dissanayake because we need to know more details on these international examples, how they have implemented. I mean, you were focusing on Sendai protocol, Hyogo one, and then most importantly, the 2030 agenda or 2030 sustainable goals. To what extent they have achieved it, or when you come to certain countries, I know that they have not even touched these areas. But if I ask from Professor Ranjit Dissanayake, could you describe some world examples of sustainable development achievements in same scenario?
Yes, thank you. Let me see what is this sustainable development is very simply. We need to have the economic growth. That is the most important thing. And then we have to, doing the economic growth, we have to protect the environment. Then we have to have the happy people, the social. So that means that we have to have the infrastructure, facilities, where we must be in the green environment because we should protect the environment, and the people must be very happy. So that is in a way sustainable development. Sometimes the economic growth and environment protection and the social inclusion. Basically, people must have all the facilities while having the green environment, and the people will be very happy within the environment. So that is what we need, whether it is in Sri Lanka or whether it is somewhere else. So even through the development goals, what we are trying to maybe giving some targets and the goals, 17 goals and maybe 169 targets, we are trying to achieve the happiness of the people while progressing the economy and the protecting the environment. So that is the main thing that we have to do. So when you go to the world situation, of course, some countries like German, they are trying to get rid of nuclear by 2030. So where they are targeting about while making the efficiency of the whatever the resources that they have, they are trying to develop the solar and the net zero buildings and various ways. This is the one area. This is the energy conservation and the renewable energy is the one part of the sustainable development. So then we can think about the agriculture sector also. So how are you going to, we have the limited land, how we are going to produce the material for the growing generation. So we have, as we have the limited space and so forth. Then we same thing, have the water. So how are you going to efficiently use the water, right? Even maybe in a building, in any situation. So then in a various way that some countries has gone, right? As I mentioned, the German, even the energy efficiency in Japan is increasing. Singapore is making the greener city as well as a greener rooftop. By doing that, on the amount of energy used for the building and so forth. And the similar way, because the when you go to the sustainability, it is water, it is energy, it is in the environment, it is the land, it is the material. Everywhere we have to achieve this sustainability because we are limited of the natural resources. So what we are doing end of the day, we have to make sure that the people are happy. But people have all the facilities while making sure the environment is greener. We are not going to touch the environment. So in that respect, different world has been doing a lot of research and gone to the bigger way. So when you go to the world situation, is the world is developing toward the sustainable development goal. Thank you, Jaitunga.
Yeah, so very important. Your point is whatever sustainable goals we have, people should be happy. End of the
Yes,
day.
very important. Most
Very
important thing is
important.
that.
So, yes, whether it is renewable energy or energy efficiency or green city or whatever, if people are not happy, there is no meaning. That's what
Exactly.
you are trying to explain. Yes,
Exactly.
very well explained, sir. Thank you very much. If I ask from Dr. Asiri regarding some world examples, once again on resilience structures, we have had many major disasters situations in world. So in front of that, could you give us some examples how resilience is ensured in structures, basically, Dr. Asiri?
Yeah, well, I think when you talk about the resilient infrastructure, I think in the world scenario, I think I would like to talk about Japan, where I have some experience. So as you know, Japan is a earthquake-prone country, and that is one of the major threat for them. So, but now when you look at the Japan history, so they have developed their infrastructure system to sustain whatever the earthquake with high magnitude. So it's a continuous development. I think in 1995 they have some earthquake in Kobe, then some other earthquake. So continuously they did the experiment and they developed the design criteria. And today, so they have a very good or resilient infrastructure against the earthquake. So as you know now, recently they have a very big earthquake, but very minimum damage, and they are expecting another big earthquake, and for that now they have already done the design. So I think that's a very good example in Japan how they prepared for the major disaster like earthquake, because as you know, some other countries like some Middle East countries like Turkey and some countries, I think they had the earthquake and massive damage. But that kind of magnitude of earthquake in Japan is, give the minimum damage because they have prepared. So it's a very good example how the resilient infrastructure can minimize the damage. At the same time, tsunami also same. Japan is a very, prone to tsunami, and they have developed some cities, like a Sendai. So some cities very close to the coastal belt with the guideline and these kind of thing. So they are they got a minimum impact from these disaster. For that, so they have the continuous research and development plan. For example, they are continuously updating their building codes. They are continuously updating their design criteria. So for that, they are doing a lot of research work in the industry as well as the academia. So I think that is very important. So we can get this example to plan our, future and the plan our development. Not only Japan, when it comes to most of these developed countries, so they have very good plan system with these building codes. And Sri Lanka, I think, when you talk about that, now we have already prepared, already commenced to, have a building codes with the CEDA in BRO and other universities. So I think that will be a kind of landmark in our resilient infrastructure. So because in Sri Lanka still we are following some guideline and no defined design criteria or regulations. So I think with these building codes, so we can achieve the level that already achieved by the developed countries. I think With that, I think that's a kind of international example I took from Japan and how they got this one with the R&D work and also developing these building codes. I think so. Those are the lessons that we can get from the other international scenario when we talk about the resilient infrastructure.
I think we cannot forget Japan when you come to resilience, because they are the country which is facing major disasters in the annual calendar. So definitely, you take a good example on Japan. So with that, if I ask from Mr. Arambepola regarding this development of township or cities, basically particular areas, how a city or township or an area can be built in a sustainable manner. Can you give some examples for us to understand, Mr. Arambepola?
Thank you. Since Professor Disanayak mentioned about Hong Kong, I think I will elaborate more on Hong Kong. It is one of the good examples I can cite actually. Hong Kong is generally committed to take action under the Paris Agreement to become a carbon neutral country by 2050. In 2017, Hong Kong released the Climate Action Plan 2030 Plus and committed to peak carbon emissions by 2020. And by 2030, they plan to reduce them by 26 to 36% from the 2005 level. So they have a goal to achieve by reducing net emissions.
2005, 2005, what is the percentage, Mr.?
26 to 36 from the 2005 level.
Okay, right.
So they have a certain level at 2005. So they
Yes.
want to reduce the emissions by 26% to 36% by 2030. So they have a goal to achieve reducing net emissions actually. And also they want to make a carbon neutral country by 2050. So Hong Kong has taken initiatives to model and also analyze emission scenarios. And they have identified some sectors they use for research, innovations, and also for building partnerships to achieve their goal. What are these sectors? The sectors are energy sector, building efficiency, transportation, waste management, then also to have a low carbon lifestyle for all the people actually. And nature-based solutions are one of the most important things among them also. So they plan to reintroduce nature-based solutions to revive the natural processes and also the functions in the built environment. So they plan to recover, recreate, or reinvent nature in the urban landscape that way actually. So what are the specific areas? They have selected some specific areas for that. As you know, Hong Kong has a phenomenal amount of coastline, which is covered by coastline wetlands, mangroves, reefs, etc. This is one specific area. Also, the other is mountain areas. Among the most natural capitals, they consider mountain areas as one of the important things. So the mountain areas play a big role in this. So well-managed mountain slopes have the highest potential to reduce landslide risk on one way, and also it has a potential to reinforce cities' climate resilience. In addition to that, they also have potential for water resource management. There are several other initiatives also. One is tree planting. Usually tree planting is done to expecting clean air and also reduce pollution. Then also they have a program called Room for Rivers, that is to alleviate flood risk. Then they have many country parks for harvesting rainwater to maintain clean air and also for leisure. So also they have many ways to green the rooftops, walls, other urban structures. They also have some special structure called biospheres. These are vegetated mulch drainage paths with gentle slope designed to concentrate and convey stormwater. So they plan to introduce such changes across the government as well as commercial enterprises. Most importantly, they also want to have individuals, populations involved in this achieving this goal actually. So they have many programs covering these three sectors: the government sector, commercial enterprises, as well as individuals actually. So I would like also to pick up another example. This one is from Philippines. As you know, there is a city called Marikina, which is not very far from Manila. It is a shoe capital of Philippines, or the biggest manufacturer of shoes. River Marikina flows through this city and getting normally affected annually due to flooding. So earlier, the river banks were neglected area. They were polluted, unhygienic areas full of slum dwellers. And slum dwellers usually suffered the most. So there was one mayor, Marides Fernando, during the period from 2001 to 2010, she has implemented a program called Marikina River Anti-Pollution Program. And she has relocated around 10,000 Scotta families along the Marikina River bank and created a beautiful park actually, which is one of the major recreation areas for the population now. There is also a fault zone called Marikina Fault actually. So they are expecting one day a major earthquake. So therefore, she also planned to resettle the people living in the along the fault line. So residents living in the epicenter area have been also evacuated, and this park has been extended actually. So these are some of the good examples, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I will stop here.
Yeah, I think you can call them as green cities, I suppose. And these Philippine examples, you have this personal experience with Philippine examples, I believe. So as per
Exactly, yes.
little discussion I had with you, is that correct, Mr. Aramepula?
Yes, exactly. Yes. We have worked with them.
Yeah. It's time for us to also consider green cities. It can be should not be a dream actually. With the way that we are going, we should be able to focus on green cities also. So we are coming to the next round now. Actually, with the international scenario, we all understood how world is heading towards green cities, nature-based solutions, sustainable development, resilience structures. So we had a very good understanding on the international scenario. When you come to local scenario, how this has been implemented and what are our plans. So that is what we are going to discuss. 4 minutes is allocated for each panel member. Let me talk to first Professor Janaka Wijetunga. Professor, how Sri Lankan climatic conditions, to begin with this discussion, how do you say Sri Lankan climatic condition and environment can affect the resilience in structures? Professor Janaka.
Right. So I guess here we need to understand the potential impacts of climate change on the built environment, and then think about how we can tackle or adapt to such scenarios, potential future scenarios. So I guess we need to incorporate adaptation strategies into our practices. So the environments that we design and build today will be suitable for a range of future uncertainties. Now, as you know, climatic conditions have always been incorporated or integrated into the building profession. But our codes of practice and standards typically assume that the future will be similar to the past. So any potential climate change may require that we update the relevant codes of practice and standards, I would say with the best available knowledge, and again, maybe to the extent that is currently possible given the range of uncertainties in such predictions. Now, in fact, planning to adapt to the effects of climate change in the built environment first requires an understanding of how the regional or local climate in our part of the world is likely to change. But unfortunately, local or regional level understanding of climate change effects for this area, this part of the world, is not very good. And we generally tend to rely on global averages for some of these parameters like temperature increase, sea level rise, and so on. So these extremes in climatic conditions, and then how to anticipate and incorporate those extremes is a bit of a challenge, given that there are uncertainties in such projections into the future. But as I said earlier, I guess in any case, we have to make do with the best available knowledge and information and then proceed with that. And by the way, now, more broadly speaking, a disaster risk assessment, I would say, should be an integral part of major projects in the planning and design stages. For example, similar to an EIA, so that our structures will hopefully be more resilient against potential hazards. And I'm not too sure whether I have fully answered your question, Engineer Jayatunga. At least partially, I may have provided some information on that.
No, actually, you were touching this area, that extremes in climatic conditions. Actually, we have to focus and we have to have a good analysis on extremes. Right. I believe, yeah, that's what you're trying to say. We have not, have we developed to that extent to predict extremes? That is what you're trying to touch, I believe.
Correct. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and there we have a lot to study, and there we have a way to go. So that is why all of a sudden we get extreme, and then we are trying to give right reactive measures rather than we don't have a preventive measure for extremes. So then it's a challenge for having a resilient structure. That's what you are trying to say.
Indeed, yeah. Yes.
Yes. So if I ask from Dr. Asiri Karunawardena, you are the head of this authority. What kind of disasters are expected in Sri Lanka? We know that, but this question will complete the whole session. That is why I'm asking this. What kind of disasters are expected in Sri Lanka, and what are the broad categories of disasters in terms of Sri Lankan context, and what is your plan to face these disasters, Dr. Asiri Karunawardena?
Well, I think in Sri Lanka, so I think basically we can divide into natural disaster and the man-made disasters. When it comes to the natural disasters, flood, landslide, high wind are more common, are more frequent. And in the flood gives a lot of damage to the infrastructure, economic damage, but landslide occurred a lot of fatalities or deaths. And the man-made disasters, some fire, chemical disaster, etc. we can talk about, but in Sri Lankan context, I think that's not so significant compared to the damage done by the damage occurred due to the natural disasters. When it comes to the natural disaster, so I would like to talk about the landslide disaster, one of the frequent and a lot of damage occurred in Sri Lanka due to the monsoon or torrential rains. So we have how we are going to manage this landslide disaster in the country. So as you know, NBRO is the mandatory organization for that one. So first, what we did or what we have been doing is we map the area, the potential area. From that, we identify high hazard area, moderate and low hazard area. And then we try to identify the risk at these areas. So we analyze the risk level. So high risk, moderate, and low risk areas. So our how we are going to treat this or reduce the risk from each category. So in the case of landslide, we identify about 15,000 families are living in the high risk areas. So it's very difficult to reduce this risk by the mitigation or other methods. So we are going to resettle or relocate them in the same places. And when it comes to the moderate risk area, we have been starting a lot of large scale mitigation work. From the mitigation, we can reduce the risk to the acceptable level. Then the low risk areas, so we try to live with the landslide or live with the living in the disaster concept. For that, we have been installing a lot of early warning systems and give the message to try to give a good risk communication to the people. So from that, we can safeguard the people. So this is our strategy in terms of landslide. And when it comes to the buildings, so we always encourage to have a kind of a resilient building, not just a building. For example, when we resettle these landslide people who are living in the landslide areas, so we try to build a resilient house. What is a resilient house? A resilient house is the house that can be withstand for the natural disaster like a high wind, flood, and the minor tremors and this kind of thing. For that, of course, we have to have some kind of additional features. From that, I think we can minimize the damage. As you know, in Sri Lanka, we have been paying a lot of money for these kind of damage or as an incentive or the incentive or damage. For example, every year, same house are getting damaged, we are paying the damage. Instead of that, I think we can have the kind of resilient structures, we can save the money. Of course, initial investment may be a little bit high, maybe 10% higher than the normal structure, but long term, so we can save a lot of money. So our strategy is invest some money for the preparedness and mitigation rather than the response phase. So I think that is the government strategy. So I think we are working on that one. So I think we start new projects under this with this objective. So I think that is in line with the government development agenda. So rather than investing for after disaster, we try to invest money for the preparedness and the design phase and have the sustainable resilient structures. So that is our objective.
Yeah, that is one example actually. This with regard to landslides, your organization have been working on more on quantification, basically identification of risk, high risk areas, and then you have developed so many action plans, and then at the same time you are talking about this resilience house. I have also read many publications which were developed by NBRO with regard to that, with your leadership. So we have got a good insight on that. So Mr. Aramepula, yeah, apart from that, what measures do you propose for the next 10 years to ensure disaster and climate resilience in development? Like, you know, Dr. Asiri was explaining on landslides and how their organization is working on that. But as per your experience, for next 10 years, what measures we have to propose in Sri Lanka for this topic?
In the last session, actually, Dr. Engineer Jayathung mentioned that, you know, we also have to have green cities. Yes, I see an essential need for application of nature-based solutions for future development process in our urban areas, with the goal of achieving ecological sustainability and also climate change resilience. In this way, we also should consider along with that the community well-being and safety. Also, we should ensure environmental benefits and maintaining the aesthetic appearance and beauty. My suggestion is to go for wide application of green infrastructure in 3 possible ways. One is in our country, you know, conventional engineering infrastructure is very popular. So one is to, you know, go with that. with additional knowledge-based solutions. Also, we can have as an alternative to generally most popular conventional engineering structures, also nature-based solutions. Or we can have, hybrid solutions in combination of both. I think we have several examples, not many, but like Beethoven and all. But I feel we can have generally consider a lot of applications as green infrastructure. One is we can have stormwater and drainage management systems. We can have retention ponds around the Colombo area. Now we have several retention ponds. Even I am living in Borlascombe area, so we have several ponds here also. We also can expand wetlands to store flood water and to improve the water quality. We also can add vegetation to make green roofs, walls in high-rise buildings and even in other buildings. We are now doing a little bit of work with NBRO to introduce nature-based solutions to landslide prone areas actually. We can use selected vegetation types with very good root systems to protect vulnerable slopes in hilly areas. We also have several examples on that also. We can have hard and soft permeable pavements. Then I have seen Professor Disanayaka is, taking a lot of initiative to have trees along along the roads, so we can have green streets. Also, NBRO has started already, greening the retaining walls. There are many applications, nature-based applications in NBRO executed, retaining structures in landslide-prone areas. What I have not seen, but we can try also creating urban forestry, then green parks, wetlands, and also green drainage corridors. So these bioengineering methods, of course, will improve the appearance, bring them closer to as natural, and also there are other advantages actually. Green infrastructure can promote usage of local resources, labor, and also materials, vegetation and plant species. In our research with NBRO, we have seen some of the species even can grow in commercial level, like fruit trees, local herbal species, and that will help elevating the poverty or addressing the socio-economic vulnerability of communities, and also this will help to build their resilience. Summarizing this, what we can do is we can do green infrastructure planning. I think we can easily integrate these things into physical, spatial planning, and also infrastructure development. Hopefully, we can execute this with close coordination and participation of specialists in physical planning and also engineers, engineers who are doing their infrastructure designs. We can introduce green infrastructure through appropriate design standards. We have to develop design standards and also design manuals. Also, we can develop proposals, and also we can use it in the screening process of any other structures. So we can use green infrastructure as safeguards actually. So in this way, I think it is essential to build a close collaboration between property developers, urban planners, local community, and also with professionals. So government has started actually some urbanization in green structures in some urbanization areas, but I think we need to have a way to finance the green infrastructure. So we can have pilots with government funding, but I think local government are the best to take up this initiative in future. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think you explained it. Next 10 years, what we wanted to achieve. If I ask from Professor Ajit Disanayaka, you being the leading character in the authorities, so we know that we have to essentially follow these 2030 sustainable goals. to what extent we have followed the sustainable goals as of now in our society, Professor Ranjit?
Yeah, we have a lot of program launch in order to achieve the sustainable goal. So one is that we have actually these two programs initiated by myself. One is the Surakubu Ganga program. This is the Clean River program. So that was actually established while I was in the Ministry of Urban Development. So that basically simple concept is to that actually concept came through the Honorable Basil Rajapaksa. He wanted me to see that our future generation can drink the water from the river if required. Not to drink always, but in case if they are thirsty after the hiking or something like that, they will be able to drink the water from the river. Why he asked so? Because that was a situation about several years before. Even I can remember that our childhood, we used to drink the water from such places, not always. Right? So in order to achieve this one, this is cannot be achieved as it today by week, month, year. It needs years, years and years. When the people again start to drink the water from the river, you and me not be living in this country, right? But we have to start from the somewhere. So that is where this Surakumu Ganga program was initiated. So that is very simply, if you want to say that our country is clean and green and everything, when the heavy rains comes, our streams should be very clean. If our streams are not clean, we are doing something wrong. It is the like our attitude and everything, because we can throw away the garbage into your backyard, but when heavy rains come, everything will float. So it will end up with the river. Then whatever the dirty that you are throwing away without any discipline, you can see on the river. It can be plastic bottle, it can be plastic garbage, you name anything. If a river is clean when the heavy rains ends, then you can say the country is cleaner and greener. So that is the one concept. As Mr. Arambepala mentioned, that I have started another program with the present Ministry of Rural Roads and other infrastructure. That is to plant 2 million trees along the roads. So we have already started.
How many million, sir?
2 million trees along the roads. We have already started doing it. Actually, we did few planting today and yesterday also. And we are going to do it all the district, all the main roads and around the country. But we have to make sure that the right plant and the right date and the climatic condition and all we have to check. We do everything and we are planting it. So that is one good program, because end of the day, after one strategy that we are doing, we are trying to plant nearly 200 trees along the main road of all cities. That means after another 10 years time, these trees has come up. People might see the difference between when there is a no tree and when there is a tree. So that then the future generation may think about the respect in the plants. Another program along with that we started is the working with the wider cooperation. One area we work with the universities, we work with the schools. Right now we have started another program with the schools. We are working with the Ministry of Environment. We asked about the places, how many places do they have to plant the trees. So we are going to supply the trees and we are going to start that program also. So why we are doing so? Because as it today, the president of this country is in a school. The Minister of Environment is school. All the ministers are, all the secretaries are, all the executives are right now. So we have to work with we are very keen to work with the schools, because this is where we have to change. We have to, in order to get the sustainable built environment, the sustainable development, main point is the environment. In order to respect the environment, people must be ready to respect the environment. Therefore, education and training the younger generation is the key, so that this program is catered toward education children of this country. Hope I answered the Tilak's question.
Yes, sir, very well. I have a personal feeling that although we have 17 sustainable goals, at least if we can achieve these two in longer run, I mean, the water from river is a very good concept. I mean, it is not only Surakimu Ganga, it is Surakimu Sri Lanka. If we can achieve
yes, excellent. Yeah, exactly.
Ganga is if you can safeguard Ganga, we can safeguard the Sri Lanka, whole Sri Lanka. So and also 2 million trees and many other concepts related to tree planting is implemented. Actually, really appreciated, Professor, for your commitment towards this sustainable development and green concept, developing green concept in Sri Lanka. So let me go to the next round. This is the final round of the discussion. So of course we have to talk about challenges and way forward. You have touched way forward in certain topics, but we have to summarize all what we have discussed. You know, we have a lot of challenges, not only economic challenges, but socially and then environmentally, and then many other administrative challenges are there. So all these concepts are very good concepts, and we have people like Professor Ranjit Dissanayake and many other panel members here, NBRO and many other institutes. They are trying hard to implement these things, but we all know that there are big challenges, and way forward is it's not that easy. So let us discuss that part. Professor Ranjit is the one who will be starting this once again. Based on the current progress, how our future should be adjusted in terms of sustainability. How do you foresee this, and what support do you require to implement these things from authorities, from people, from institutes? You can explain this. You are given 5 minutes for this. Of course, you need more minutes, but I can give 5 minutes here on this.
Yeah, Tilak, thank you. So support, actually I'll start from there, because when you talk about the sustainable development, one area I've been working during last 11 years, like working with the Green Building Council, and presently I'm the chairman for the Green Building Council of Sri Lanka. So when you go to actually out of the 17 goals, we are directly concerned about the 9 goals. How can I say the 9 goals? Because the greener building can improve the people health, so that the goals number 3 will be covered. Likewise, some of the activities, like for example, we respect the circular economy principles. So that means we covered goal number 3. I'm not going to lecture one by one. Basically, we cover the 9 goals. So that we have been pushing this concept. When we bring the greener building concept into Sri Lanka, actually we were a bunch of the expert or whatever the people get together and form the Green Building Council. So the number one thing that we cannot do this alone. We need as I told me, we need a wider cooperation into especially in order to achieve the sustainability, we need the wider cooperation. You can't do it alone. You can't do it alone with the law and regulation alone. We need to understand the people. Therefore, we understand is the most important is awareness. How are you going to do the awareness? You can't do the awareness alone. you can speak only if you speak all the day, only 8 hours you can speak to the people. How can you do that? You can't do that. So we need to train the people. So therefore, we started the training program. The first thing that we did the training program, for the time being, we have trained 1,500 or more professionals of this country who know the greener building concept very well. Yeah, maybe 50% will be practicing, the rest will be just learn it, doing their own way. But still, we have trained that 1,500 professionals in this country who know the greener building concept. Now we have come to the situation while we are doing the training, we have to implement this. We have developed nearly, maybe right now we are working on 100 greener buildings. So the concept, so that we need to do it. We get time to time some barriers. Some people suddenly come and they want to do the greening. Sometimes government trying to do the greening their own way. But we have been discussing right now. Also, we are discussing with the Urban Development Authority, and we are working with the previous one ministry, and we don't have the greener building concept. We have the city tool also, greener city tool. We have the greener schools. We have the greener infrastructure. We have the certification material, and the many tool has been developed for the time. Like 8-9 tools has been developed, but the implementation is not that easy. That need awareness and everything. But we do have the barriers. Some people say that the greening is expensive, but greening is not expensive at all. Greening is another investment. For example, if you use the solar panel, of course you have to pay some money, additional money. But after 3-4 years, depending on the size and all that, you will recover that amount from the line. Right? Then after that, you earn some money because you are not paying high electricity. Likewise, greening is an investment. Then the people argue, how are you going to invest without money? Then comes to the point where we need to have the support from the bank. Banks would say that if you are going to go for a greener building, interest can be reduced. Right? Then another area, when we go for the licensing and all that, if you're building the greener building, the license, like the different kind of tax and all that, can be reduced. Likewise, we should support from the government, banking, people, and so forth, because the greening itself has a lot of advantage. You are comfortable, you are happy, and many things will be there when you live in the greener building. But how can you explain everything? It's not that easy to do that, right? So that what I say that we are now having the Greener Building Council for the 11 years. I'm saying that another 10-15 years later, we should have a Greener Building Council, because every activity that we do must be a green activity. Therefore, we don't have the specific Greener Building Council. Everything like you go to the ISL, it should be greener. SLEDA, it should be greener. MBRO, it is a green. Everybody should do the green, because there is no way without doing the greening and the sustainability. If you do not care the sustainability, you can't live it. Very simple. You can't be happy. Whatever the money that you have, whatever the properties that you have. Therefore, sooner or later, we have to convert all the activities toward the sustainability. All the learning, all the attitude, all the behavior must be a greener behavior. Because we have to protect the environment, otherwise there is no survival. So that is simply, we have to, I think government is doing right now, okay. We will push forward to more and more greener, so that we are committed, make sure that the greener, sustainable development will be taken place. It's not that easy, but never think we have to go again. Thank you.
Okay, sir. I think you explained it very well. Professor Janaka Wijetunga, after Professor Ranjit Dissanayake, for you to answer this question will be a challenge, because Professor Ranjit is so passionate, and then he explained very well on challenges in current context. But the same question I'm asking in a different way. What are the challenges for developing a green economy in Sri Lankan context and also the sustainable development goals, because many other countries, all in all, they are talking about a green economy, having considered all sustainable goals and then practices and nature-based or whatever, all these concepts, when you put together into one basket, so we can talk about a green economy. So maybe a long way to go, but still we should start discussing this and then progressing. So as per your view, Professor Janaka, what are challenges? What are the challenges that we have to face for this?
Right. Yes, indeed. It's a bit of a challenge coming after Professor Ranjit Dissanayake on this particular topic, sustainable development and then green economy and so on. Yeah, the question is this green economy in Sri Lankan context, and more importantly, I think, as you mentioned, the challenges for developing a green economy. I think that's the main part of the question.
Yes.
And in fact, as Professor Ranjit Dissanayake mentioned, outline at the beginning of this segment, he outlined different aspects of sustainability and sustainable development. And in a broad sense, achieving sustainable development is, of course, the ultimate target of a greener economy. So sustainability is the key primary long-term goal, and this green economy, in fact, provides a pathway to sustainable development. And if I quickly also mention that this green economy is, primarily based on several main sectors, which some of which I think Professor Dissanayake identified in the previous segment. So the green economy is, based on several main sectors, including renewable energy, green buildings, as he mentioned, sustainable transport, and as he mentioned earlier, water management, waste management, and so on. And for example, management of land use and development. So all these, sectors coming under a green economy. Now, a green economy, of course, requires investments that allow reduced carbon emissions and pollution, and then, of course, enhanced, improved energy and resource use efficiency. And then another aspect, I would think, prevention of loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services and so on. So that is another aspect of green economy. And by the way, I mean, talking about green economy, since recently we have sort of a counterpart as well for this green economy, that is the so-called blue economy, referring to this ocean economics. So blue economy refers to the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth. Anyway, coming back to, in any case, now I think particularly during the past decade or so, or even in more recent times, this concept of green economy has become a strategic priority for many governments. But in any case, as Engineer Jayatunga asked me, there are challenges associated with creating a green economy. So there are challenges associated with creating a green economy. And as Professor Dissanayake quite rightly mentioned earlier, it's not easy. It's quite a bit of a challenge. It's quite hard. So some of these challenges, I guess, include, probably number one, financial constraints. Limited budgets is one, and to some extent, the technology also. These are some of the challenges, I guess, and also, I mean, if there is an unforeseen economic crisis or national crisis, in that kind of situation, one casualty is going to be the green economy, because the benefits of a green economy are apparent or visible only in the long run, or usually in the long run. Now, I just mentioned about these unforeseen economic crises, and by the way, the ongoing COVID pandemic may be one such situation right now. So in such situations, in the absence of short-term returns, the priority of many governments around the world is likely to be shifted, moved from green economy to the traditional or conventional economy. Because of the apparent absence of short-term returns. And also, as I mentioned earlier, that as for challenges to green economy, technology could also be a constraint, at least in some situations. Now, technology transfer is subject to intellectual property rights, and the developed countries may have the necessary technology, but sometimes they are unwilling to share such technology with developing nations. So this integration of global technologies into the green economic policies of developing nations, in particular, probably have problems, and then of course the availability of finance, or in fact the lack of it, is another problem, as I mentioned earlier. And as for challenges, further challenges, let me also maybe add this, that is now developing nations, often have many other problems like poverty, lack of, adequate infrastructure, lack of drinking water, unemployment, poor transportation facilities and networks, power shortages, and so on. So attending to such issues and problems usually becomes a priority. And as a result, this green economy, that approach sometimes tend to get, sometimes tend to get pushed down the list of priorities. And so these are some of the challenges, that come to my mind. Yeah, back to you, Dr. Jayatunga. Yes.
If I go to Mr. Arambepula quickly, Mr. Arambepula, are you satisfied with the current progress of the application of nature-based solutions into development practices to make urban development more sustainable?
Of course, we are not satisfied.
You are not satisfied, right?
Yeah, with the
why?
current progress. I think we can have a better way to do it. Basically, to fulfill the goal of building resilient communities and also supporting sustainable development, I think we should have three things in mind. One is, whatever we do as a development intervention, we should see that, it will reduce the existing risk. Also, it should not allow creating future risk. And also, any of the intervention should be capable of meeting the consequences arising due to events that are unpredictable. So, two of our previous speakers mentioned about some of the challenges and difficulties. I also have few suggestions. One I have seen is that, creating an enabling environment is one of the important things actually. To me, actually, reducing the future risk is the most cost-effective thing, but also it is the most challenging thing because we have not done anything. So therefore, if we do it properly, I think we should be able to, at least contain the risk. So it requires strict compliance with existing policy environment. I feel that we have number of laws, regulations, and also many policies of relevance. But one of the shortcomings are with policy compliance. Actually, it is a very unfortunate thing. It may be due to their poor technical understanding or implementation gaps also are there. Sometimes institutional weaknesses are there. And also, unfortunately, there are also sometimes interference with influential parties. So it is essential to encourage establishment of necessary mechanisms and also introduce appropriate incentives to ensure high level of compliance in my view actually. I think it might be necessary to address some policy gaps and also update some of them to suit the current context actually. frankly, to me, fixing the responsibility and accountability are the most important things. Then, since you have mentioned about the urban planning, I feel, we can use urban planning as a vehicle to promote nature-based solutions. I believe that the urban planning, if we can make it, if we want to make it sustainable and also resilient, so we need to, incorporate these suggestions in urban planning. We know that urban planning encompasses wide range of issues, not only this one actually, from broad scale environment protection measures to individual site specific design measures. So we should try to introduce appropriate architectural and engineering designs and also integrate in nature based solutions where possible actually. Uh, Definitely, it will have a potential, as Professor Vijay Singh said, to influence project outcomes at multiple stages and also and levels of different levels of development process.
Yes.
We also have to consider some of the environmental safeguards also. Then another important thing is to concentrate on capacity building. In our country context, local governments play a major role, uh, of course indirectly, but they play a very important role because they provide approvals for most of the development interventions, and also they are responsible for some supportive actions like solid waste management, stormwater drainage, etc. But unfortunately, whenever it is also a very weak link. Every time when issues of high negative impact present to them, they used to say that they do not have technical competent people to handle things. So we have to make it compulsory for local government to have competent technical staff, build their capacity, and also to fix the accountability for the roles they are playing. As Professor Disanayaga rightly said, we need to build a culture, safety culture actually. The awareness creation and advocacy are important aspects in creating conducive environment for application of nature-based solutions. Of course, we have to consider it is everybody's responsibility. So therefore, we have to, bring into, the like government institutions, private institutions, as well as all the community members, so that they will have a good understanding and also they
Yes.
understand the value actually. Also, lastly, I would like to say that, we need to have, way to upscale some of these initiatives. We have seen few good, important, examples like Dietuvena, but when people see such projects and experience the benefits, they also get convinced about the importance actually. But we need to find a way to finance such project interventions. Maybe we should develop some investment models like public private partnerships, corporate social responsibility, etc. In
Yes.
conclusion, I would like to state that the green building movement is now emerging as a practice acceptable to all. In the same way, I feel we should also start movement for green cities, incorporating nature-based solutions. Finally, that is our long-time wish. Yeah, long-term wish. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are coming to the last question of the day, that is to Dr. Asiri from my side. But after that, I just want to remind everyone that we will be having a question and answer session. You can raise digitally your hand, and so that we will be giving you the opportunity to ask question directly from the panel members. Please get ready your questions. So you have sent, couple of people have sent questions through chat box also. We will be addressing those questions after this question. So Dr. Asiri, now we all talk about many concepts, green, nature-based development, sustainability, resilience, and then green cities, green economy, and then we talk about all challenges and many other things we talk about for the day. Are they all, I think Professor Ranjit just touched this, but you can elaborate this more on this area, that are they all can be considered as investments, or rather additional cost to the development? Because some can say, okay, green city is a cost. Are they? Is it a cost for us, or what do you think about it, Dr. Asiri?
Yeah, you correctly mentioned that Professor Dissanayake already, partly answered this question. So all these green cities, nature-based solution, resilient structures, in the long term, of course, I think beneficial for the country's development. Of course, we have to invest some capital initially, but in the long run, that can be recovered, I think, within some certain period, design life of this structure period. One example I would like to tell you in the general terms. I talk about the resilient house. So resilient house, what we design for these affected people is 650 square foot house. Cost is 1.2 million rupees. For when it comes to the normal house, so the cost is about 800,000. So it says 900,000. So we realize that the cost for the resilient house is about 20%, 15 to 20% higher than the normal house, right? So that is the initial cost. But when we analyze all these houses, which were subject to the damage due to the natural disaster, every year we have paid 100,000, 200,000 every year, some high winds or flood or whatever, right? For that money we have been paid within a 1 or 2 year period. So you can see, so initial cost may be high, but when it's on long term or long run, it is a kind of investment. So I think we should understand that one. And also when we make a development plan, I think Professor Vijayatunga correctly mentioned, so we have to consider the disaster risk reduction factor or disaster resilient factor. For example, when we are constructing or widening a road, we should estimate what are the potential risks involved in this one, potential hazard. For example, we have to see the stability of the side slopes, a landslide threat, the road inundation. So if we have not considered in the original design, so what will happen within a very short period, I think 1 or 2 year period, road will get damaged and we have to invest a lot for the road repairing. Otherwise, this road is not usable. I think we have been experienced that in many scenarios, the upcountry roads are blocked in the monsoon period. So that impact is very high for the tourism, transportation, vegetable, and so many things. So, and not only that, we have to invest a lot of money to repairing, especially for the slope stabilization work. So, but if we have invest or if we have considered this disaster impact in the design and we incorporate into the design process, I think of course the initial cost may be a little bit high, but in long term, this will be a kind of this will be a kind of investment, and not only the financial, but for the easy, the easy life. So I think there won't be any disturbance. So we have a very good road system as well as very good resilient housing system. So it may not damage due to the normal disasters. Of course, we have to think about what kind of resilience that we need. So that is the arguable point. So we have to decide which is suitable for our country. We should not target country like Japan, where, for example, have a very highly vulnerable to the earthquake, landslides. So they have the resilient factor. The degree of resilience is very high. Whereas in Sri Lanka, we have to decide what kind of resilient, what is the degree of resilience that we need. Based on that, we have to invest. So then only, I think this investment is a kind of incentive for us. So if we have a good design criteria, if we decide what is the strength that we need to sustain for the natural disaster, I think if we design and construct accordingly, so I think that investment, the initial investment, is a kind of incentive for us, and the long term we are getting benefited. Yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you, Dr. Asiri. You came to finally a very good conclusion, that is, it is initially a cost, yes, but in long run it is a investment That is what you want to tell. So with that, I think we are ready to open the floor for questions. Our panel members are ready to answer for your questions. Anyone who is willing to ask question can raise your hand so that our organizers will allow you to talk. Chanaka Seneviratna raised the hand.
Yeah,
You can talk,
I think
Chanaka, yes.
I'm actually living overseas, so I want to actually maybe not a question but a comment. So when it comes to the disasters, there are man-made disasters and also the natural disasters. So what I found in Sri Lanka, most of the organizations, the lack of preparedness. So that comes down to the understanding of the risk management by the professionals who are running the organizations. Because when I actually interact with most of them, and actually when I did even a webinar for one of the main organizations, I found their understanding about the risk management is very limited. So they don't have any like a plan to act on when a disaster happens. So that means they don't have a contingency plan or any business continuation plans or anything. So that's one area I see that we need to actually work on as any professionals get together and then give this directive to all the government organizations, private organizations, everyone, to have a plan to respond to a disaster. So then the other thing,
Yes.
yeah. Can you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got your, it is a rather comment. You are trying to explain your experience in implementing these things. Where are you working? You are not in
actually,
Sri Lanka?
I am from Australia at the moment. I am working in local government area. So
yeah,
so
that's what basically I think Professor Ranjit Disanayak was explaining. It is we need a cultural change towards implementing these things. That's very well understood. You know, in Sri Lankan point of view, we have a lot of challenges to implement this kind of very good concepts. So yes.
The other comment I need to ensure is when we have projects in Sri Lanka, so the environmental management must be built into the project plan and enforce it. Maybe the government can subsidize or pay part of those costs, because in the long run, anyway, if environmental damage happen, it is the government pay back to correct it, because there are no responsible peoples to get so there's enforcement and so the building.
Can any one of our panel member answer to this Janaka's question, please? Professor Ranjit?
Yeah, in any project, actually, we get the environment clearance, and sometime at the beginning, people say because of that they can start the project and so forth. There are plus and minus. The investors want to build the building and project immediately and go for the business. Then there are so many rules and regulations within the government. Maybe there are nearly 17 organizations. From 17 organizations, we should get the approval. So that is the both side. The approval side, there are 17 places where we should get the approval. Other one is the investor or the people who want to start the business. They want to do this immediately. So how are you going to balance between this? Therefore, especially Her Excellency President want to identify this kind of location from the government side. And the environmental clearance and various other clearance will be taken to the lands which is suitable for the investment. So when an investor come, he not only get the land, but also the clearance from the various other. These kind of things have to be done. Of course, as Janaka correctly mentioned, that the end of the day, government have to pay. That has been understood from the government.
Yes, you mean a central location for approvals rather than going for 17.
Not only approval, but also some places they have taken the approval. We don't have to, that approval is there.
Yeah.
Not like the lead of the, but the approval, environment approval is there already.
Mm.
Yeah, we should have a system like this. Then only investor will be encouraged to invest.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we will go to the next question, please. I know that there is another person who raised the from Sarah to everyone. Do we have the professional body? What the question? I think he's asking. Do we have a professional body? So the question is not visible to me right now, Chamila. Or anyone, any other question, please? Someone raise the hand. Or may I ask this question? Are we analyzing the carbon footprint of all infrastructure development projects and planning to identify the optimum level and balance for the offset? This question was asked by Sierra. No name is mentioned, may probably a company name. Are we analyzing the carbon footprint of all infrastructure? If I ask from Professor Janaka regarding this, sorry.
Yeah,
hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whether we have been doing that, analyzing and evaluating the carbon footprint of structures and so on. Whether we have been doing that or not, I'm not exactly sure. Perhaps I think Professor Disanayake may have a better idea on that.
Actually, we are encouraged to calculate the carbon footprint and all that, but we are not doing right now. For example, when we go for the tree planting, what my suggestion is to we have the office. For example, we have the Colombo head office and the provincial, and it is so we are trying to calculate the amount of the carbon dioxide emission. Then we have to find out what are the amount of the equivalent amount of trees that we have. Then we can say that we are carbon neutral, something like that. But there are technology, learning, and everything is there. But particularly, there is no agencies asking about the carbon footprint. But this thing might come later. But when you go to the green building concept, we do the calculation. But those who are not doing the green building, there is no the provisions to calculate the carbon footprint. Hope I answered the question.
Yes, yes. And another question asked by someone called Laksiri Sirivardhana. Policy improvement in river reservations to avoid encroachments in floodplain is essential for sustainable development as well. As a country, we don't have policies in those areas. We can't implement nature-based solutions without policy implementations. If we consider basin scales of rivers such as Kalani, Kaluging, Ilwala, and panels throughout. So the question is asked by someone called Mr. Laksiri Sirivardhana. Mr. Arambepola,
yes,
were you able to answer this question?
I think there is some truth in it, but I think now at Survey Department is trying to fix the boundaries of rivers. Actually, this is one of the major problems, because we don't have the river boundaries actually. So now I think they are trying to, fix the boundaries of the rivers. And also, there are some programs, in the river basin level to promote nature-based solutions actually. So these are some of the good aspects. For instance, if you see the Colombo area, there is a Veras Ganga project where, they apply a lot of nature-based solutions, especially, they are creating ponds and also improving the river network and things. And also, in future, I heard that, there will be similar initiatives in other basins too. So I hope I have answered the question.
Yes. Then another question from Kuluni. Has the construction industry in Sri Lanka taken measures to quantify the long-term benefits and pitfalls obtained from transferring to green building application, since there is a general conception that sustainable solutions are too expensive? Professor Ranjit, what you can say about this?
Repeat the question.
What she's asking, has the construction industry in Sri Lanka taken measures to quantify the long-term benefits of green building applications?
Yeah. We do that actually. We are trying to calculate as a Green Building Council of Sri Lanka, we are trying to calculate the amount of the impact due to the green building there. But we are making this kind of data in order to convince the government how much benefit that we have. For example, if you can say that the amount of electricity saved because of the green building, this much, or something like that. So these are the things that we are working on right now. Hope I answered.
Yeah. Yes. And another, we want to hear your voice, ladies and gentlemen. If anyone wants to, someone called Dakshya. He's raising the hand. Please talk, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yeah.
I'm Dakshya. I'm a Peradeniya graduate. I'm now doing my postdoc in Singapore. I'm working in an Institute of Catastrophe Risk Management. So I have two questions for the panel members. First question is, how our policymakers handles the disaster shock created on interconnected system, for example, electrical, transport, local business, and government. For example, when a disaster shock happens, and it affects all the systems directly or indirectly. So my point is, it is important to account the interconnections in the planning stage itself. So how our policymakers are handling this situation? That's my first question. I have another question on risk financing. What are the financial solutions available for frequent and catastrophic events? For example, insurance, reinsurance, risk investments, or any other innovative financing. To my knowledge, insurance penetration in Sri Lanka is very low. And when a catastrophic event happens, and how our economy handle it in a resilient way. These are my two questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, Dr. Asiri. You are involving with many of catastrophic situations. So how do you handle this interconnection, Dr. Asiri? What she's trying to ask about this interconnection between all services, and also then second question is about insurance and financing of when this kind of situation happens.
Yeah, we have the National Council of Disaster Management, which is chaired by the Excellency, and other members are the Prime Minister, Cabinet Minister, Opposition Leader, then the district governors, everybody is there. So every 6 months time we have the meeting, so that we are making these plans according to that one. So once you know, once you understand, you can understand once the excellence is there. So he has all power to implement those plans, right? So now we have been starting doing this one. So it's a, as she correctly mentioned, disaster management is not a single entity business, it's a everybody's business. So all the stakeholders get together and plan accordingly. Selection and understanding the risks. I think we have to plan it. So I think we are doing that one, but I think we have to go a long way. For example, as I mentioned earlier, so once we have the big, extreme event like a heavy rain, so our road system getting damaged and the electricity, of course, the failure is there. So we have to have kind of a contingency plan, and we are discussing that one, and every institution has to make a plan, contingency plan for that one. I think so within the coming years time, I think we can achieve those targets. And then the second question is the risk financing. In Sri Lanka, I think it's one of the few countries that we have the everybody is insured for the natural disaster. Still we are kind of welfare-oriented country. So everybody is insured for the natural disaster, including, the poor to rich people. So if your house is damaged from natural disaster, you can get about the maximum about 2.5 million rupees maximum, but with the damage assessment. So that this is the impact risk now, and we have been trying to do some kind of insurance scheme, but problem is still only the landslide areas we have developed the risk map, but other area like a flood, high wind, those area we have not developed. Of course, we have developed, but that scale is not enough to insurance company to invest that one. So that's why we had several discussions with this insurance company. So it's still they are not. They said that these information are not so reliable. So I think we have to develop this map up to the standard, and then only we can go for the risk financing or risk insurance. And we have for the catastrophic disasters, I think government has insured with the World Bank with maybe I remember it's 100,000 US dollars like something. If there is a catastrophic disaster, we can withdraw that money to recover the economy. That is impact risk at the moment, I think. Yes, I think it is there. So for the catastrophic event, so that mechanism is there. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. We can allow for another one more question. One question, so that we will conclude the session after that. Is there anyone who is willing to raise another question? So we have received many other questions digitally, but I would like to give one chance for raising the question on live. Okay, if not, let us conclude this session for today. Actually, we have been talking about many things on resilience and then sustainable development. Let me, all in all, conclude this by giving a small summary. As Professor Ranjit initially mentioned, our ultimate goal should be everyone should be happy when we implement anything. So that should be our goal. And for that, we have nature-based solutions. We talk about national and international examples for that. And then also green cities were spoken, and that is not a dream. Actually, we believe that we can go for that. And of course, Professor Ranjit once again mentioned Surakhi Muganga and planting trees. Those are some of the programs which have been implemented right now. And then again, green economy was spoken about. Then we went up to Resilience House. So all in all, all these world standards, protocols, and then concepts are built on, as mentioned, to make people happy. So we have a lot of challenges, as everyone has spoken about. Working together is another one challenge, and this is we need a big cultural change, and adaptation of green technologies is another challenge. And as mentioned, we need compliance framework, and also capacity building is very important. So altogether, when you take everything together, so this will be a big discussion for days and days, but we were trying to give take a little understanding and little detail on the subject with the given time. So let me conclude the session. Thank you for everyone who supported to organize this event. Special thank goes to Chairman of Library and Publication Development Committee, Professor Ranjit Disanayake. Thank you very much. And also, I must thank IESL, all staff members, and then media manager, especially Chamila, who has given me a very good support to arrange this, and then panel members, all the panel members who participated for this event. And finally, everyone who supported to make this event a successful one. Let us meet once again on March with another key topic to address in Sri Lanka. Let us meet again on March. Please join with us. Thank you very much. Thanks, and have a good day.
Thank you, Tilak. Wonderful session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you
Bye.
very much.
Thank you.